Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ali Ramsey. I am West's Communication Coordinator. Thank you again for joining us for this webinar. Today's webinar is Story-Based Branding, Capture the Meaning of Your Work, and it's presented by Rachel Molina Chan. She's a story strategist at Dwell House Communications. So if you have any questions throughout this webinar, please put them in the Q&A box. You can see that there. There's also a chat box, so I encourage everybody to tell us a little bit about your business, who you are, introduce yourself. We'd love to hear that. This webinar is being recorded, and you will get a link to this recording about 24 hours, so tomorrow around the same time, so you will have access to the recording as well. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I am going to pass it over to Rachel.
Thanks so much, Ali. All right. Nice slides up for you here. Okay, thanks so much for having me. Thanks to Wesk, and thanks to all of you for joining me today. I saw some familiar names in the list, some folks who maybe have seen parts of this presentation before. So thanks so much for being here and for taking an hour out of your day to talk about storytelling and how it applies to branding. All right. When I do my intro, I always like to emphasize that storytelling is this thing that all of us have been doing since we were little kids. And while I'm going to be talking about maybe some new concepts for you today, a lot of it's going to sound really familiar and sound like things that you've been doing since about age 7. And the idea of framing your own life or your own experience as a story is something that you've got practice in already, and you can practice every day. And so I do all the time when I do presentations like this. I run through the 5 W's to tell you a little bit more about who I am. I'm Rachel Molina Chan. I use she, her pronouns. And I am a story strategist, as Ali said. It's a name I gave myself because I felt like it was the best moniker to capture the thing that I do most, which is help people tell their stories and tell them in a strategic way. I'm an entrepreneur. I have my own business, and I work with lots of other entrepreneurs. And I also work in the community organizing space, the stuff that doesn't pay so well, but that really I'm passionate about and helps make the world a better place, hopefully. Where I am, I'm coming to you today from the unceded territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, also known as Victoria, BC. I'm from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon. I was born and raised there and just came out here out west a few years ago. So I'm a prairie heart, but I don't mind having the ocean out my door either. When I am, it's always funny to say where and when you are in an intro, especially the when, it's a great moment to remind ourselves that we get to frame our stories subjectively, and the when changes all the time. And so I could tell you I'm between coffee 1 and 2 today. I could tell you it's Tuesday or that it's fall. But in terms of our conversation here today, I think a relevant piece of info about when I am is that I'm about 10 years into this work on storytelling and learning about different models of narrative theory and how to apply them in the real world. And why I do that is because it's incredibly powerful. I've witnessed this power of meaning making, and I really have a desire to help other people share their stories and their experiences in a way that really evokes our values and what matters most, and ultimately changes the world. Just small stuff. I do a lot of things and I wear a lot of hats. So I wanted just to throw this screen up to show you a couple of the things a couple of the places where I do storytelling. I have my own business with my husband, Dwell House Photography and Communications. And we apply storytelling to different media and content creation projects. I do a ton of my work with Molly Seaton Fast at Arcana Creative, a great design studio based out of Saskatoon. And you're going to see a whole bunch of Molly's work through the slides today, because often I'm bringing some storytelling work to the table and she's applying incredible design work to bring it to life. And then I also run a project, a collective called Eco-Anxious Stories. And that is a project focused on mental health and climate change, and how our stories and how we relate to climate change can actually really evoke a sense of belonging and help other people see that their fears and dread about climate change doesn't have to stop them in their tracks, but can actually activate them to changing things. So feel free to ask me about any of these things at the end, but I wanted you to know where I'm coming from. Okay, I'm going to start today by just talking a little bit about why story and what we're going to be sort of focusing on in terms of the themes and the frameworks for today. And then the second half will be a bunch of examples of how this applies to different businesses at different levels of their awareness or articulation of their stories. So hopefully you're going to see yourself in here somewhere and kind of say, oh yeah, that's where I'm at, and that's where I would start to put these tools into practice. And you'll see lots of opportunities to work with me and Molly and other people in that way if you so choose, but hopefully there's lots of takeaways here for you. So the reason why I focus so much on storytelling, especially when it comes to helping businesses articulate their stories, is because it's a great model for connecting what we understand in our heads, the kind of facts and figures and stats that ground us, the heart stuff, the values and emotions that inform our choices and our motivations. Pardon me, and hands and feet stuff, the actions and the tools that we kind of practice every day, and why we do that. So it brings all these things together. Stories are universally human. All cultures use them and have used them throughout history to connect with each other, but they're also culturally specific. So there's this kind of subjectivity and objectivity going on at the same time in this model. Stories help us manage the complexity of our lives, and there's lots of different motivations and key characters and all kinds of different things happening in stories. And we know what it means to have, a chapter within a larger book, within an anthology. We can think in terms of levels when it comes to stories, and it all is really nuanced. But like I said at the beginning, because we learn this stuff so early in our lives, whether it's through the acquisition of language or having your parents read books to you or experiencing media and entertainment, there's all kinds of stories around us that help us understand how this stuff works. And there's lots of different ways to explain it, but this is the model that I use. And it's heavily influenced by Marshall Gans, who's a labor theorist who brought storytelling to the world of, in this particular way, to social change and activist movements. And it's where I kind of got my feet wet in this work. And so this is Gans's 4-part model, talking about the challenge, the choice, the outcome, and the moral. And I've added a couple layers here in my work to bring it to life for me and my clients. And I ask, what matters? What's at stake? What do we want? And what will it take? That last one should not say what's at stake. That's kind of funny. What will it take? You'll see that appear on some other slides here. Okay, there it's showing up, right? So why branding? We've talked about why story. Why do we do branding? Hopefully you're a little bit convinced that this matters if you're here at this workshop, or if you, are a member of WESC, you have an idea of what it means and the challenges of running a business. And so it's not as big of a sell here to tell you that this stuff matters. But branding is key because it helps us find our place in that story that we're living in, that context that we make choices within. It brings clarity to the thing that you're doing that other people aren't doing, or that are doing similarly to you, but on a different level or in a different place. It brings us consistent framework for the multitude of people and personalities behind the scenes if you're not a solo business. And if you are a solo business, it really helps you kind of put on a particular hat or coat or voice when you're that's different from the complexity of who you are in order to have a consistent message. It also helps us bridge the gap between what we're thinking, those ideas in our heads, those values, as I said, and the actions that we take as a result. So when I'm doing workshops like this with a particular entrepreneur or a business or an organization, this is where we start. And some of you are clients of mine, and you've started here with me, that we talk about what's the challenge your business or your brand is interrupting? What mountain are you scaling? What is the thing that you think you're immersed in here when it comes to tackling a problem or adding value to the people that you serve? That's a fairly clear starting point when you start to think of the problems that you're solving. But part 2 gets into the heart of the story a bit more, where we're thinking, okay, who are the key characters here, and what choices do they have about this thing that we're tackling? What kind of motivations are going into the stakes at hand? What's the fork in the road that they're sort of up against, that they are making a decision within? Which is slightly different than the actions, right? The choice is more of an emotional or value-driven piece. And it hopefully leads to outcomes that we want. So articulating what we want, or perhaps what we want to avoid, is a really key part of articulating your brand narrative. What alternative or potential are you looking to forge? And what will it take? And this is the action piece that's more like a first step. What does this represent to other people to engage in your story? And what invitation are you extending to them? So here's an example of a brand narrative in action and how it's grounding the time and place and key characters related in the work. This is one that we did for WESC earlier this summer as we were, Molly and I were hired to work on their annual report. And we needed to start with some of the story stuff before we get into what happened this year. We need to articulate why WESC exists in the first place and what the point of all of this is, so that all of the stuff that happened this past year makes sense and is clearly situated in a context. So we talked about in terms of what matters. Well, Saskatchewan depends on entrepreneurs, but the gender entrepreneur gap is holding women back. That's a what matters. That's a problem. That's a challenge. That's an opportunity, and it's the kind of framework for this whole organization. So, what are the choices involved there? What do we do about this, and why is it important to do something? Well, WESC helps close the gaps by supporting women who are starting, growing, or scaling a business. It's pretty obvious, but this is sort of the role that they're playing in that story. You've got an issue and you've got a business that's coming and making a choice to intercede and change the course of that issue. And so that little arrows in the middle there is really where all of those values come together. Well, why would you take on that role? What's motivating that? What do you care about enough to do something like that? And what is the result of those feelings? And the result is that WESC has created this hub for entrepreneurs. They're building capacity and possibility for the future of women in business. So they're closing the gaps by offering these services, and they're building something with that intersection, with that interjection and into the story, and they're creating a new outcome. And the call to action that this story implies, if you agree with this, with the story, if it resonates with you, then you're called to get involved, because when women succeed, we all succeed. So let's remove these barriers and support women entrepreneurs in Saskatchewan. And the call to action is specifically around removing barriers, because that's a key part of this story, that there are barriers to overcome. And so it seems very obvious when it's on the page, but without this on a page, it's hard to have a starting point to start to communicate all of the nuances and actions and programs underneath your story. So why do we tell stories? Well, we do this oftentimes because we're actually trying to understand what archetype the brand is actually playing in terms of that role, that personality, the choices that they're making in a story. That relates back to a particular personality or characteristic that oftentimes we can see reappearing all over the place, because they're kinds of characters that we just have most association with as we navigate all the different kinds of stories in our lives. And this is proven, psychologically, that we're really wired to make associations and references and linkages to what we already know. We're looking for that confirmation, and sometimes that can be a bad thing for sure. But when we're doing branding, we're really trying to, in an instant, communicate something complex to another person. And so we do that by really tapping into the innate relationship that they already have to sensory information, to colors and facial expressions and the size of a letter and the shape of a picture. It all influences what we recognize culturally and personally. And so I'll just ask you to chime in the chat if you want to take a guess at the archetype that's going on in these pictures that I've jumbled together. I believe I did a search for a certain rain jacket company or a couple of them and pulled some of these images. And if you have a guess out of this list of archetypes: caregiver, outlaw, jester, explorer, hero, innocent, sage, ruler, lover, everyday person, magician, or creator, what's your best guess? See, one person for explorer. Anyone else gonna chime in? I think that, yeah, 2 for explorer. Anyone want to add one more guess? Okay, explorer is the consensus. Well, I think you are right. I said explorer and maybe outlaw as well. There's a little bit of an outlaw vibe going on here. And we can sort of take that cue. If this person is playing the role of an outlaw, we can start to wrap a story around that. Okay, what are they, or sorry, an explorer, what are they exploring? What are they moving away from in order to explore? What is the dark place that they're sort of adventuring to, and what are they seeking? And so when you look up, the explorer archetype on Pinterest or on the internet, you'll see a lot of different great information about their key characteristics and their motivations. This is another layer of information that we can kind of glean and explore. And it comes down to what matters, what's at stake, what do we want, and what will it take? And so here I'm guessing, this is my take, that we're focusing on the constraints of society and how modern life is comfortable, which separates us from the natural world. So there's already a lot of values and assumptions going on with identifying the challenge here. What's at stake? So what do you do if you're surrounded by modern comfort, but really you want to be your own person and you want to be tough and you want to be isolated and you want to take on the elements? Well, you have to escape. You have to escape the meaninglessness of the grind. You have to have the courage to be alone, to find that freedom. So this is really a step that what will it take? The moral of the story here is to be courageous enough to face the storm. And in the tiny text there that you probably can't read, it says, get tech-packed gear to make rain cry. So there's something very masculine going on here. There's something very sort of almost aggressive about how we need to be tackling and exploring. And so there's this whole kind of story, I think, going on behind what this personality is communicating just through colors and images. You see some great work from Arcana here, from her work on Treaty Land Sharing Network. This is, I think, a similar archetype in terms of the color scheme. Like there's some similarities going on here. But if you swap out the characters and change the story, all of a sudden you have something totally different, both visually and conceptually. And so the stories can also be a great way to really ground your characters. And instead of just thinking of your audiences or your stakeholders or your partners, these are all characters in your story. If you work with them, they must relate to you and the public narrative, the framework that you're working with in some way. And there's power dynamics there for sure between the characters. So oftentimes when we're working with brands, we really encourage them to map out these characters and start to be honest about what kind of relationships you have so that we can narrow in on what this brand is all about. So here again, I think we're seeing a discussion about, the constraints of society and the constraints of a particular reality. But here it's a colonial reality, which is causing not, a separation from this natural rugged world, but the, ancestral lands of the people of Saskatchewan. And so this brand is all about connecting with each other, being tied to each other's cultural sovereignty, actually having a stake in each other's freedom. And the characters here want to circumvent and push back against something, but it's not just sort of, again, like the fluffiness of life, but it's more about colonial relationships and actually connecting farmers with Indigenous land users. So we're here thinking outside the box still, but it's a very different kind of explorer brand. So these two examples, we're working kind of from a brand to story. Oftentimes it's the other way around, where we don't have a brand yet, and we're trying to get there in an authentic way. We're trying to capture the meaning of the work in the decisions that come out around the brand. And so this is an example of a brand that maybe you could guess at just by thinking of the story. Maybe some visuals start to come to mind for you. So let's imagine a brand where what matters is really taking time for yourself, having practices that lead to long-term health and beauty. What's at stake? Well, in a world that doesn't really contribute to long-term health and beauty, we need things that offer purity and cleanliness, nourishment, and the capacity to continue showing up in the world. Without that, there's something else. There's something not pure, not clean, not nourishing. So the heart of the story is all about connecting those things with the ability to escape the grit of the grind. So a different kind of explorer kind of theme here, but this one's all about feeling like we're enough, having tools and time to feel good. But it's going to take that you prioritize your own care and invest in a sense of calm, invest in your own body and the skin you're in. Any guesses at what kind of company would have a story like this? What kind of product might have a brand story that relates to this? Health, beauty, yoga, mindfulness, those are great guesses, all kind of similar brands. If you think about, popular companies that do those things. Yeah. This one, I said, it's, a lot of kind of health and beauty product brands, I think, kind of come back to this idea. We're probably looking at the innocent or caregiver type of combo. And you don't have to be restricted to those 12 archetypes. We'll talk about some other examples, but it's a great way to start to get our bearings on the themes. Just do a quick time check here. So yeah, I think this one relates and resonates that there's something really kind of calming about the colors and the shapes and the light and the way that these products are even captured in the photography. Didn't add any taglines here, but you can start to imagine what they'd be. They'd probably relate to some of these story pillars. So part 2, why should you invest in your brand story? Why should this matter to you? And it's, I think you can come at this from a lot of different angles, depending on where you're at in your development of your story as a brand. And so if you are just starting out and have never defined your brand identity, this would be sort of what I'm thinking of as kind of a level 1 brand story. And we get a lot of people coming to us in this boat who are either starting a new business or taking it in a new direction. Or maybe they have a new commitment to a more consistent identity. And I think a lot of folks are in this boat where maybe you're upgrading from that, vector logo that you were able to buy for $5 just to get started. Sometimes you just need to commit to something to get out the door. But this is great for teams who are really just starting out. And I'll give some examples of level 1 work. Level 2 examples will kind of focus on brands that really needed a new refresh or refocus, brands that maybe have been around for a long time, but they're responding to a new context or a new development in their work. And it's just, the brand work that they've done so far just isn't kind of cutting it. Too much has changed. So this is great for those who are upgrading from an out-of-date version of what they have. And level 3 would be people who really feel confident in their brand. They like their logo, they like their brand kit. They've got lots of ways to use their palette and their type and their graphics and all of that great stuff. And they want to apply it in context. So they're creating something. Maybe it's an annual report or a campaign or a poster or anything else. And so this process is really great for taking that story and starting to think of, okay, well, who's the audience for this particular product or this particular message? What's their story? How can we start to bring those two things into relationship and actually carve out something really strategic? And so we'll see some examples of that as well. I'm gonna take a sip of water and chime in the chat if you already kind of know for yourself, if you kind of fall into one of these 3 categories. I'm curious. Got a level 1, level 2, level 1. Some 3s, that's great. Good to hear. Awesome. Okay. Let's get into some examples so you can kind of see how this looks in practice. And I'm going to be showing off a bunch of other people's beautiful work. So here we go. Okay, so level 1 brand story is really about finding your personality and your voice and trying to bring that together in a way that you feel like you can articulate with confidence and consistency. So the 2 ways I usually come at this is to either pursue a brand or a story coaching relationship with someone. So it would be more long-term and we'd meet more regularly over time just to kind of really get under the surface of what's going on with your ideas and how you want to put that into a more visual or a key message kind of language. So usually these are people who are really into the process and really want to dig in and want to leave with a pretty fulsome understanding of a communication strategy, as well as a bit more practice and homework to really have this kind of hit home. If you don't have time for that or can't afford to kind of meet that often, we also do a direction that's just really about creating a strategy for a particular purpose. So that might be just literally getting a story strategy in place for all uses or really directed at a brand development or something else so that you're getting a product out of it besides the framework itself. But either way, we do tackle these kind of 3 areas of narrative. And this comes back to Marshall Gans again and his work in the labor movement, talking about our personal stories. So what brought you to this point in the journey personally as an entrepreneur? The public narrative, so that's the context surrounding your brand and your personal brand narrative. So all of the kind of like political or economic or social or any other kind of context that sort of like makes your brand make sense. And then the brand narrative itself, which is different than your personal story and different than how your business came to be, and much more about the assumptions and values and actions that your brand contains, that disruption of the public narrative and your reason for existing. So this is one of the few brands at Arcana that isn't an Arcana one, but it's a group I worked with called Hey Nova here in BC. And they are a women-owned tech company who do really excellent work. And it was really fun to get into their story because they wanted to really distinguish themselves from other tech companies in terms of what they focus on and what they care about and what makes them different than their competition. And so we kind of got under the surface of their story and went with a hero magician archetype. We felt that was the best one to articulate their values and their personality and give them a good launch pad for talking about the broader context of their work and the calls to action therein. So their story starts Act 1, curtain rises, and we see, hey, there's a lack of representation in tech. There's unfair limits on our ability to connect with each other because certain people aren't at the table. And they talk a lot about on their website, different statistics and different evidence for that reality. So usually the challenge itself is something that's quite grounded and that you can really point to and say, hey, this is real. This is something we need to do something about. What's at stake? Well, for them, it was that without designing digital systems that meet everyone's needs, we're only halfway there. If you can't actually have an accessible website, or if you don't care who's behind the scenes making these decisions, then you're not going to catch the people that you want to catch. So this is a high stakes story for a business that would be hiring them. What do we want? Well, we want a diverse team who can transform traditional approaches and allow you to get so much closer to close the gaps in access. So this story is already about something more than just having a pretty website. It's about a high stakes situation where you're not going to reach everyone you want to reach. You don't have the right people at the table. And so you should choose a team that cares about who you connect with and prioritize accessible digital design. So here they're going above and beyond just talking about how there should be more women in tech, but also talking about people with different abilities and disabilities and how we need to be designing things with everyone in mind. And it was just a really fun project to work on. And they already had brand visuals in mind, and they already really felt like they were getting to a place where they wanted to be in terms of articulating themselves visually, but they didn't have the language. They weren't really sure how to, write a social media post about what they felt about this. And they were really passionate about it, but they needed some help kind of articulating that public narrative that they were up against and their role in disrupting it. So we ended up in a place where they were really confident. And you can see now on their website, if you go to heynova.io, that they talk quite a bit about stepping boldly into the future of tech. And their story is about a turning point that we don't have to do things the old way anymore. There's people ready to take this on who are already innovating and already kind of bringing a different perspective. And so we talked about where they are in their story. When you're doing digital work, the geography doesn't matter so much, but socially, what's your position here? Are you the underdog? Are you someone that's where the hero kind of part came in? Are you someone who's really going to champion something for other people? Are you the magician, someone that transforms possibility, that really creates something out of nothing, that feeling? When are you in this story is also an important question, and it's one that often doesn't get asked. But what important developments or changes or historical moments are shaping your story? We were also working, I don't have a slide for this, but with another business that hasn't launched yet, but Molly and I worked with a group called Crane that does pro bono work for Black and Indigenous people of color who are developing their businesses. And that brand, we talked a lot about how supporting women in Black women in business is there. You have to ground that in a historical context for that to really make sense about why it would be so important to be offering that kind of support right now and to that particular population. And so when you are in your story, it really matters. And of course, the why, the motivation, what values and moral clarity that you bring to your assumptions and your perceptions and your decisions. And you'll see that this would be hard to do if your only motivation was profit or exploiting people. So we don't really have a lot to offer brands that are really just focused on that because we can't make that a moral story. We can't have a moral of the story there. That's something that other people want to participate in. So you will find us often working with purpose-driven businesses, and they're not all nonprofits, but people who are really clear on what they're trying to do and why. Okay, level 2, it's colorful. Level 2 is sort of this idea that you might have a need to refresh and refocus your brand. And so this is when you might need to really get outside the box of your archetype options, and you might want to go across beyond those 12 that are often popping up on Pinterest. This is about honoring the complexity of what you do if you do something for a lot of different people or in a lot of different spaces. And this example comes from Island Sexual Health, which is a community health center here in British Columbia in my town. And we worked with them because they had a couple of different parts of their clinic. They had a clinic and they had an education program area. And they also had a store that sells sex toys, as well as a lot of literature and different just sexual health products. And they wanted to kind of bring them all together under one brand, but recognize that they all kind of serve a different kind of group. Education's working with different school groups. The clinic has all kinds of different patients in all kinds of different age groups. And the store also had a lot of different people of different ages and experience levels coming to learn more. And so they wanted something that still kind of captured the fresh, youthful energy that they have, but had some flexibility in terms of how it was applied. And so Molly and I worked together on this to create a brand family for them and have a parent brand with 3 child brand identities. And instead of using one of the archetypes for this, one of the 12 archetypes, the archetype that we went with was more out of literature and film. And it's the archetype of the warm house. And you can think of a show like X-Men or somewhere where there's like a big, Hogwarts, like there's a big castle where everyone kind of has a space for themselves, and it's happening and it's dynamic and it's warm and welcoming, and there's a place for everyone. And so the organization really needed a brand story that captured how many different spaces there were and what it felt like to move from, seeing your doctor to learning more about sexual health to buying a dildo. Like there's a lot of, there's a story there about why you would think of all of those things for one person or for different people. And so different audiences, but a common identity. And we talked about this house, this warm house, having 3 different areas. So the clinic was kind of like the kitchen table, and the person you found there was a little more parental, a little more paternalistic in the sense that you're going there for care. You're going there to maybe talk to someone, maybe get a prescription, maybe get mom to open up the medicine cabinet, but it's a safe place. Education is a little bit more boisterous. There's a little bit more out in the community. It's kind of like being in the backyard of the house where neighbor kids might be passing by, but everyone's welcome and there's lots to kind of get into and get practically into. And then the store, we wanted to give a sense of calm and just sort of like, come here to learn and don't worry about what you don't know. Just kind of be welcome in this warm library where you will, always have a place to be alone or to be helped, but it's going to be a comfortable time for you. And this is the parent brand. This is another example that's similar, actually, but a group in Saskatoon. This isn't a health clinic per se, but you might know Out Saskatoon has a great logo that was designed by Fred Reben. And recently they came to us because they were looking to apply this brand in a few more places. And often you find yourself in this boat where you're like, I have a great logo, I have a great identity, but I'm struggling to apply it every day, whether it's on social media or the website or talking about it, it's tricky. And so this is a really fun exercise that we do in some brand story workshops, especially when we're trying to kind of bring together a complex identity. And so we took the 4 story pillars in the Out Saskatoon story, and we chose some wonderful figures from fiction and real life that really emulate these different roles that the organization plays. So they have a common brand identity similar to Island Sexual Health, but we wanted to fill their clubhouse with different people. And so you've got the loyal teammate, the creative leader, the loving friend, and the confident advocate. And we had a lot of fun talking about how the different staff members related to one part of this personality over another. And so it was really useful to say like, oh yeah, that's why I kind of feel out of my element sometimes when I'm playing the confident advocate, because I'm not feeling so Lizzo today. I'm feeling a little bit more like Leslie Knope, like the loving friend who's a little bit more maybe behind the scenes, but who's playing that role of coach for the wider community. So this is a lot of fun, and it always looks different for each client. Okay, level 3 is really when you are ready to activate your narrative and you're feeling good about the voice that you have and what you want to say. But now you're ready to put it into practice and actually share that story with someone else. And so whenever we're asked to put together externally facing messaging and content for people, Molly and I typically go through a story strategy session prior to getting into the design. And this was a fun example from Saskatoon Sexual Health and their syphilis campaign. And so we had, this was last year that we kicked this off. We're going to be taking on round 2, but the first round, it was really important to Saskatoon Sexual Health to work with the people who this campaign is for in its design, which is a great rule of thumb. And in this case, we were really looking at the queer community in Saskatoon and young people, but all kinds of different folks that were younger than me, we'll say that. And so it was important to kind of get in and get everyone in a Zoom room and start to think about what actually resonates with the audience that this brand story is intended for. And so we had a lot of fun thinking about it in terms of TV shows, which you'll see is a bit of a running theme in my work. But we pulled together a bunch of examples of other syphilis campaigns, and we kind of ranked them, or not ranked them, but categorized them rather in different areas related to whether or not they were kind of coming across more using scare tactics or using facts and figures, informational approach. They were trying to be edgy, or if they were trying to be funny. And we kind of thought of those as like different genres of a campaign. And we plotted out a little bit of the key characters in each one, who's in this kind of narrative that's scaring people that they're going to get syphilis if they have sex, and how can we maybe, either choose to lean into that or go in a different direction. And so the youth that we consulted with determined the genre, that we were going to go with something kind of funny, but also edgy. They populated the story with key characters who they wanted to see in the ads, who they wanted the ads to be geared towards. And then we came up with a moral of the story that resonated, that wasn't just about negativity, but actually sex positivity. And I know that like 3 of my examples are from groups that work on youth and sex, but people talk to each other and they hire us because they like our work. So that's where you're seeing some themes. And it's fun. So we had a lot of fun designing the messaging for this. And I think we did come up with messaging that maybe would have been different if it hadn't been in the year of a pandemic, let's say, because that was one thing we noticed, that it was hard to but it was hard to be in a brand space with other health messaging last year. And so we leaned into it instead of away from it, and talked about masking up in the sheets as well as in the streets and in the sheets. Our dumpster fire one is focusing on how things are pretty bad and we don't want to add anything else to the dumpster fire of 2020. So yeah, this was a lot of fun, and it really came from that exploration of the story and the genre that we were going for. And I think this is my last example. This is the work that Arcana did for WESC this summer, working on their annual report. And so here, again, this is how I got to know WESC, and how we started this whole idea for me to do this webinar was because we went through a story strategy in the preparation for their annual report. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we actually used that to create the outline for the annual report, not just in terms of the messaging, but also the structure. And so we use those story pillars, the what matters, what's at stake, what do we want, and what will it take, to organize how we were going to talk about programming, where we were going to talk about the fundraisers, where we were going to talk about the staff and the thank yous, and just using this idea of like where we want to start, what we want people to feel, and what we want them to be inspired to do when they finish reading it. That's a really helpful way just to make some of these subjective decisions about what comes on which page. So what time is it here? We've got like 20 minutes left in this workshop, and I'm very happy to answer questions and go back to any of the slides that you like more information about. But I'd like to take a couple of minutes here to just have you focus on your own story and the story that you are bringing to the table here. And if these slides have been sort of getting your wheels turning and thinking about maybe an application of your narrative or a new way to think about your narrative, it'd be great to just take a few minutes here and actually have you process that and write some things down if you've got a paper in front of you. And if a few of you are up for sharing or asking questions about your narrative, I'm happy to use the rest of the time to either workshop one person so you can kind of see how this works in a session, or just answer any questions you have, or have you share your brand narrative if you're feeling like you can answer these questions. What matters? What's at stake? What do we want? And what will it take? So I'm going to stop talking and drink water for a couple of minutes. Answer these questions on paper if you have one, and throw in the chat if you do have either some questions or if you have a particular way that you'd like to see this the rest of the time we have go. I'm quite happy to, like I said, run through an example or answer any particular questions you have about your brand narrative. So pop those in the chat for the next 2 minutes here while I just take a breath. So keep writing away if you're taking some notes or doing some thinking. I'll just answer this question that's popped in the chat here. Chrissy asked if I usually use the 12 brand archetypes as a starting point for level 1. And I think that I can say yes to that. It's a really nice starting point if we're trying to find our way in a story that's pretty unarticulated. I will say I do like to use them in combination and do a little bit of a hyphenated situation in order to bring a little bit more nuance and depth to an archetype. The problem with archetypes is that they're oversimplified, right? That's the beauty and the problem of any archetypal prototype. If we're really trying to understand the context surrounding that, that's where the story comes in. And that's where you can actually say, I'm an explorer, but in this particular context, motivated by these particular values to reach these particular characters. And so it can be a useful starting point for getting into that story, or if you have a story, it can be useful for starting to identify personality. But we would always use an archetype in combination with personality descriptions, discussion of the voice at hand, discussion of the values. And what was the other? Oh yeah, and then the other thing I will often do is talk about a persona as well. And so sometimes I articulate it as, archetype is something that's quite identifiable in other media. A persona I think of as the person you are in most rooms. If you can think of like the role that you tend to play in a particular situation and the kind of characteristics that you are more often. And that's where that character study can come in to be really helpful to talk about, whether you're a loving friend in most times. That's not really an archetype. It's a kind of archetype, but it's a bit more about your persona in a particular space. For a brand we worked on that was a consulting brand that is focused on meeting young women, we talked about how it's almost like you're a music producer. You're kind of like in the studio, you bring the talent in, you really nurture them and bring the best out of them, but you're cool, you're hip, people wanna get to know you, wanna partner with you. And that persona just kind of gave Molly a little more to work with when she's coming up with the visuals and the color scheme and the palettes for these brands. It gives a few different versions to play with that's a little deeper sometimes than just using the archetypes. Good question. Are there any other questions? I'm curious if anyone has anything on their paper, if they feel like they are able to articulate a little bit of their story, and perhaps if not, like what feels like the hardest part of the story to articulate. So maybe I'll just pop that into your minds and see if anyone has any thoughts in the chat or the Q&A. What's the hardest part of this for you if you're thinking about your own story, or if it's not so hard and you'd like to share a little bit of your story with us in the chat, or I don't know if Ali has a way to unmute people, but I'd be happy to hear from you in the last few minutes here. For those of you that said you were level 1, I'm curious if anyone is feeling like this is starting to identify a little bit for them who their archetype might be. And if you're level 2, yeah, I'm curious if any characters come to mind. Again, we don't have to answer these questions, but I want to be giving you a few more things to think about as you're taking away. If you're not feeling like you want to chime in the chat. Level 2, if you can think of any characters that really represent who you are or who you're trying to get at. And for level 3, what kind of deliverables you're looking to put together, and what kind of things you want to maybe support with in applying your story. I'll just zip through the questions here now that a few of you have chimed in. All right, Tara says she recently bought a partnership in a Canadian business coaching firm. She's the first Saskatchewan location. Okay, so the where of your story is going to be pretty important, Tara. How do you connect agriculture, teaching, and business to get the story across without being too narrow for the audience? Well, this is a great question because Tara's already thinking about who is going to hear her story. And this is the interesting thing when we do story development, is to know, to really start with what's meaningful to you so that you're not feeling inauthentic when you're reaching out to your audience. So we really do try to start with just what do you think is going on here? What do you want to say? How are you connecting these dots? Because you are passionate about all these things and you're one person. So something's going on in your personal story about how these things align. And so we would start by really asking, like, what matters to you? Why do you work on agriculture and teaching? And why are those things connected to you? What happens if no one's doing the work that you do? What would happen? What are the stakes of what you're up to? What do you want to do by bringing these things together? What is your goal, and what is the role that you're playing in bringing other people's stories along? And then what is that invitation that you're extending to them? Is it to learn if you're a teacher? Is it to join a community? Is it to take action in some way? So those are some of the questions we work on to get started in your story, Tara. But then we would want to look at your audience's story. So what matters to the people that you work with? Does agriculture matter to them? Does teaching matter to them? If not, you might have to figure out another common ground and frame your story around that. What are the stakes for them? What do they think will happen if they engage with you? And what would they maybe not anticipate would happen? So it's good to know if the stakes at hand are apparent to your audience, or if that's something that your story needs to do, is elevate that sense of, hey, you need this. What do your audience members want? Is it the same as your goals, or do you want to nuance it a little differently to be more clear about what they're getting out of the exchange? And then, yeah, what's that invitation for them? What does the moral of the story mean for someone who's really far along in their journey and really gets it? And what's the call to action for people who are maybe not on board yet and need a little bit more coaxing? And then using that kind of process, you can come up with many different audience stories, key messages that are geared and designed for different people, for different purposes. How do you know when a story is good? That is a great question, and testing the impact is key. Just like any deliverable, to be able to really understand how other people are hearing your message through focus groups, through A/B testing, through all kinds of methods, is really useful. But the concept that we come back to a lot is narrative fidelity. And I didn't come up with that term. It's kind of a literary term, but basically it just means like when all of the 4 parts of the story, in this case, the story pillars, when they actually make sense together, then you get narrative fidelity. When the opposite of that would be narrative dissonance, which is that sense that, the challenge, the choice, and the outcomes and the moral of the story really don't align. There's no common thread through this. There's no central value that makes this make sense. So an example of that would be, if you identify the challenge of your brand as helping women. Let's say Wesk is working on helping women entrepreneurs, and the stakes at hand are, if we don't help you, then you're going to have less opportunity. But then if what we want has nothing to do with what women actually need, if you start talking about a completely different thing at this point in the story, then we're starting to lose. Okay, well, what does that have to do with helping women? Or if your programs, you really haven't identified a reason for offering them, or you haven't located the value add, then there's something going on in your story. There's some room for strengthening. And it might just be that we need to put in some different key characters so that this is really making sense. Might mean that we need to change up the voice and take on a different persona, because we're asking people to do something different than what our persona is really all about. It's hard for me to not think of examples that relate back to my work with eco-anxious stories, but we talk about narrative dissonance all the time with climate narratives, that, you know, you're told the world is coming to an end and all you need to do is change your light bulbs. That's the moral of the story. And there's no alignment there between, you know, the scale of the problem and the ask of the story and the stakes at hand. And so when we're talking about narrative fidelity, that's what we're talking about, is having these 4 story pillars all connect and make sense based on who's in the story, where they are, when they are, and why they're doing what they're doing. And then test it to make sure your assumptions are correct. I think we've got time for maybe one more question. And Ali, jump in anytime if you need to say any closing words before I stop talking.
Thanks, Rachel. Well, does anybody have any last questions in the chat before we head out here? Give people a few minutes here. Just a reminder to everybody that's on here right now, our next webinar coming up is Fraud Awareness and Education for Business Owners, which is really important, and that's on November 3rd. You can sign up for that on our WESC website. Any last questions before we head out here? Okay, well, thank you, Rachel. We really appreciate it. That was super interesting. Just a reminder to everybody that if you have any questions, we did record this webinar and we will be sending it out to everybody about 24 hours from now, so sometime tomorrow. So you will get a link to this recording. So if you need to go back and look at the slides or see what Rachel was talking about, you can definitely do that. So thank you, everyone else. Oh, and it looks like Rachel put some links in the chat as well. So if you want to check out those links, you can grab more information, and I'm sure Rachel will be able to answer questions if you think of anything after this as well. So perfect. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.